Okay, once again, we want to use factoring. We're looking at this example here. I want to use factoring to try to simplify. I've got a fraction here, and at a glance, it looks like there's probably some kind of relationship between that numerator and that denominator, but the numerator has a cosecant squared, and the denominator just has a cosecant. So since the numerator has a squared, I would want to try to factor that one. So let's see how that works. Since it says cosecant squared minus 1, that means that that's actually a difference of squares, because cosecant squared of theta is a perfect square, and 1 is also a perfect square. So we know that that factors into conjugate pairs. So we'll have 1 minus 1 plus, and then we would just have the square root of the first term for the first position. Oops, that's cosecant. And the square root of the second term for the second position on each of those. So that'd be 1 and 1. On the denominator, I don't have a cosecant squared, so that one's not going to be factorable. So I'm just going to rewrite it. Cosecant of theta minus 1. Now I need to look for things that can cancel with the numerator and the denominator. In order to cancel, they have to be expressions that are identical because we have those pluses and minuses attached to our trig function. So we can't just cross out a cosecant haphazardly. I do see that I've got a cosecant theta minus 1 in both the top and the bottom. So I can cross that out in its entirety. What that leaves is just a cosecant of theta plus 1. And that cosecant of theta plus 1 is left over in the numerator. Everything canceled out from the denominator on this one, which means you actually don't have to write the denominator anymore. If everything had canceled out from the numerator and there was still something left in the denominator, you would still have to write it as a fraction, and there would be a 1 in the numerator position. We're going to go ahead and do this next one, or at least get it started there, and then you can answer the question on the form. So for the second one, there are 4 terms. There's a secant cubed, a secant squared, a secant, and a 1. The terms are separated by plus or minus signs there. Now, since there are 4 terms and we're thinking about factoring here, we're going to think about factor by grouping. Now, we know for factor by grouping to work, you have to have a plus sign in the very middle of the problem there. So I'm going to start by fixing that. I'm going to put the plus sign there between the second and the third terms, and that would make the next term a minus secant of x plus 1. Then I can group together the first 2 terms, leave the plus sign in the middle, and group together the last 2 terms. Now look for a greatest common factor in each of the groupings. That first grouping, there's a secant cubed and a secant squared. So they actually have a secant squared in common. So if I factor that out, that would give me a secant of x minus 1 left over. Then I've got that plus sign in the middle. In the second grouping, I've got a negative secant of x and a 1. So the only factor that they have in common is a 1. But since the first term is negative, I want to take out a negative along with that 1. Now what times a negative 1 would give you a negative secant of x? That would be just a secant of x. And what times a negative 1 would give you a positive 1? Well, that would be a negative 1. Now at this point, you can assess whether or not factor by grouping is working. In order to say that it's working, the 2 things that are in parentheses have to be identical. And we can see on this one that they are. So that secant of x minus 1 is my common factor. So I'd have a secant of x minus 1, and then I would need to figure out what the other factor is there. So if I take out that secant of x minus 1 from each of the 2 things on either side of that plus sign, my other factor would be a secant squared of x minus 1. Okay, so that's as far as I'm going to take you on this one, but that's just not as far as it goes. So now I want you to go ahead and finish it and then answer the question on the Google form.